Hey guys, and welcome back. So, this whole debacle over in Afghanistan has sparked some conversation about what would happen if the United States military abruptly, hypothetically, exits South Korea. Would South Korea be able to defend itself on its own against North Korea? And of course, yes, but I think a lot of South Koreans would rather not necessarily want to test out that hypothetical. So this question got a lot of heat recently because the leader of the Democratic Party gave a lot of clout to some dude who I guess is like a columnist for the Washington Post in the Foreign Affairs section, and his name is Mark Thiessen, like I guess like Tiffany Amber Thiessen, you know, like from Saved by the Bell. I don't know if they're related, but, and I guess we're like talking about him here, but he tweeted out, I thought he was gonna, even write, maybe you should write an article instead of just tweeting, but he made like a flippant tweet saying if South Korea were under this kind of sustained assault, they would collapse just as quickly without US support. There's virtually no American ally who could defend themselves without us. So he sparked this big Twitter debate, and there were actually a lot of Americans and people in the international community that were like, hey dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. You sound like some guy who's just like some Orientalist that doesn't know anything about Korea. The Korean military. Korea is the 6th largest military in the world, 10th largest economy. You're just like blowing smoke out of your butt. On the other hand, he really did bring up a point. And I think in general, probably like looking at his tweets, he doesn't sound like a very... like I would never want to probably have a conversation with him, and I don't think I would really want to read anything that he would write, but I would say he actually has like half of a point, and he actually does bring up a conversation that I think we need to have in terms of, I think a lot of people haven't really thought about the military situation in terms of the nuts and bolts here in Korea, and really don't understand even how the Korean people feel about it. Because even on his Twitter stream, if you actually see what the Korean people say, they are actually more a little bit on his side, saying like, well, thank you to the US military, almost as if like, yes, we can't do it without you. All right, so this is a bit of a complicated situation that we have, of course, on the Korean Peninsula. We had the Korean War, and the US military, of course, came in and helped defeat all of the forces and then stayed. And it seems as if it is, on the one hand, an occupying force because we've always had the US military here, but on the other hand, it's a very much a needed partnership. And I don't think South Koreans ever really felt like it was an occupier. Of course, politically, on the extreme left and maybe spilling over into the mid to extreme left, you'll have people who say that, yeah, it's kind of like an occupying force, no. And then people on the right in Korea would basically be like, look, you lefties, no, that you cannot call them an occupying force. So within Korea, the US military does create a political football. So US military in Korea is used as a right-left domestic political issue. So if you ever see it kind of debated among Korean people, it is for that reason. When you do see Korean people really praise and have a warm-hearted feeling towards the US military, it's because after the Korean War and during the Korean War, there was a lot of support for their lives, literally, because of the US military. And my dad in particular has told me that American cheese from the US military literally was what fueled him when he walked. He literally had to walk from Seoul to Busan, and that essentially is like walking from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And he says he doesn't remember, but like he said there were like a lot of like dead bodies along the way. And apparently like the American cheese rations for the army troops were in tins, and a lot of the Korean people, like I guess there was always like a surplus, so like you could buy them, and a lot of the Korean people thought like the cheese stank and was just like nasty, so nobody wanted this cheese, so it was like really cheap to buy. So I guess my dad really liked it, and he loves cheese to this day, American cheese, but I don't know why I don't think it really, like modern American cheese doesn't really smell. It almost smells like plastic, right? So I guess maybe y'all had more fancy cheese. Maybe it was more gourmet back then, even for the army. So they said that it like really smelled bad. So then he was just, he basically said that he tied a string around his neck and he had like a bucket of cheese at all times, like while walking down, like as if he was walking down from San Francisco to LA, just eating this cheese. And he said like it fortified him, and he was able to just like walk along the journey. And as the border kept changing, as the North kept advancing southwards, that's why a lot of people had to retreat towards Busan. And so that's why he had to make that journey, and it was American cheese from the military that was able to really save him. And then a lot of the times there was a lot of medical help from the US military and all of that. One of the big issues with current day US military, not just the defense cost sharing that Donald Trump was bringing up, but really what this tweet brought up was OPCON, operational control. So what that really means is that should a conflict break out, who gets to call the shots of what happens, like in a war, on the Korean Peninsula? It's not the Korean military, it's actually the US military. So who has operational control? It's like who gets to sit in like the captain's seat? Like, is it Jean-Luc Picard? So it's basically like the US military. And for years, like for decades, they've wanted to transfer it over to the Korean military. And there's always been a question of like whether the Korean military has been ready or not. And so that's what this tweet and this kind of jerky guy is bringing up. And he sort of has a point where, like, if we were totally ready, yeah, he wouldn't be able to even really bring this up. On the other hand, there could be strategic reasons for a delay for us to have the US take a greater role on purpose to keep them in the region. The United States itself does want to stay here because it does have also a lot of advantages and benefits it gains for having a physical presence on the Korean Peninsula. It can intercept any missiles from like Russia, China, North Korea before it goes over the Pacific Ocean, thereby keeping the United States safe. By having a presence in Korea, it's even closer than having the presence in Japan. So it's like a double layer. And so that's why we have this very important and strategic alliance with Japan, South Korea, and the United States. It's a very strong tripartite alliance, and that creates a really good cushion. It's a compromise that we've had, that we're not going to develop nuclear weapons in South Korea as long as the United States stays here. Because if we're not going to be able to have nuclear weapons of our own, then the US has to be able to fulfill that function for us. If not, then we're going to have our own nuclear weapons. Why wouldn't we? Especially if North Korea has developed them. So I believe that that's also a reason why we are keeping this alliance so tight, and that's why it's so different than Afghanistan. It's not as if we're completely dependent on the US. It's a different situation. Of course, Mr. Mark Thiessen, potentially Tiffany Amber Thiessen's relative, maybe he should be saved by the ding dong bell.
Me?
Because let's face it, the United States does not want South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons. On the other hand, South Korea doesn't want to be totally defenseless in a nuclear-armed war. But to be self-critical, I will also add that the South Korean military, though, does have a lot of room to improve, and I know I'm not allowed to say this because I'm not a Korean. When some Korean people really want to be mean to me, whenever it suits them, like if they want to make it to their advantage of like calling me an American, I'm suddenly an American. And whenever it's an advantage to them of how like I should be Korean, I should be Korean. So one of these areas where this pops up all the time is military service. And one of the reasons why I think that it really is glaringly apparent where the Korean military should have a long way to go, two things. One is, of course, this mandatory military service. And when I first came to Korea, there's always a lot of chatter. If you're a male and if you have a Korean face and you haven't served in the military, there's this always kind of, oh, you haven't served in the military. And at first I thought it was more of like, oh, you lack something, because that's sort of the way that it's presented at first. And I was just like, oh, like I must not have something that other people have, like, you know, lacking a skill or lacking a degree or lacking an experience. And then I come to realize it's actually more, I haven't lost something that they've lost. Basically, I haven't gone through a trauma. I haven't been damaged like they have. So this experience, for most people, if you want to systematize a way where you damage male egos across the nation and ensure that, this is it. Something happens in there and it traumatizes the male mind in Korea. And everybody who comes out, not everybody, but there's a huge resentment. So not everybody, but the ones that do seem to have problems in society, I think a lot of them found like a lot of their triggers in this mandatory environment where they were probably bullied and I do have come across a few people who, like, when they ran across one of their bullies in our workplace, like it triggered them, and like they kind of like they went psycho. And then the bully was like, well, what was the big deal? That was then and there. And oh, it was like ugly to see. And I was like, this is really weird. Then one of my cousins worked in the Navy because my uncle was in the Navy, and then he just left because he said like the whole way of thinking was so old fashioned and that there was like no way to feel like he was going to progress. Like, when he became older, like, you didn't think that he was just gonna be like advanced. So there's something going on in there, and obviously I think it's like what we've been talking about in this channel is like, is this going to be an evolution or not? This is a test for the patriarchal leadership in this country. is it going to evolve or is this going to fail? And I believe that this OPCON transfer can only happen when this patriarchal leadership within the military in this area has proven itself and that it's relatively ready to advance. Third, personal data point, and I'm only bringing up these personal, real, anecdotal data points that I've experienced firsthand. I once did a voiceover project for an instructional video for something related to, I think it was like an OPCON, like some sort of software or equipment for the military. And it was like translated from Korean to English. And I hope they did not operate the machinery based on this training video, because this translation was all over the place. I don't think that they'd be able to be pushing the right buttons because it was a mess, but I still had to just record and read it based on whatever the script said. And I was like, if this is like what is going out to our military, I am a little bit concerned. I'm like, should I get a boat or something? Like if something happens, like, can you just like go out to the sea? So I do think we have some work to do. And even though Mr. Mark Thiessen, like, I don't appreciate your tone, I do think that I'm glad that he sparked a debate, because I think we need to get away from this whole like Donald Trump is like fighting over a restaurant bill type of debate around the US Korea military relationship, to really kind of get into like having people more understand about like, you know, what goes on here and how special this relationship has been between the United States and South Korea in terms of our military alliance. So we'll go into some other stuff later on in other videos, but I just wanted to bring that up because you might have heard some maybe sensationalist headlines about Afghanistan being compared to South Korea and the North Korea threat, because they always try to trump up this whole kind of like North Korea, South Korea scaremongering. And just want to let you guys not to worry, because it's people like this, like Mark guy and all these kind of like weirdo people who just like try to, you know, grab attention. All right, guys. Well, we'll see you again next time. Talk to you later. Bye.
Tune in next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Love you.